I want to tell you about the morning I found the folder that wasn't meant for me. Not a letter, not a text message left open by accident. A folder, hidden in plain sight, in my own fiancé's briefcase, 3 weeks before I was supposed to marry him. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 32, and for 8 years I've worked as a forensic accountant, the kind of job most people forget exists until they need someone to find the money that isn't supposed to be missing. I spend my days inside spreadsheets other people think are boring, hunting for the one number that doesn't belong. I've helped put embezzlers behind bars. I've watched grown men cry when I showed them the paper trail they thought they'd covered. I know exactly what it looks like when someone is quietly stealing from the person who trusts them most. I never imagined I'd use those skills on the man I was about to marry. Michael Ross was 36, charming in that effortless way that made restaurant hostesses remember his name, and my coworkers ask if he had a brother. He ran his own real estate consulting firm, or said he did. He brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it without ever being told twice. My mother adored him. My sister called him the good one, after years of watching me date men who weren't. 8 months into our engagement, everything about our life felt settled. The venue was booked. The invitations were out. My mother had cried over centerpiece photos more than once. Michael handled most of the wedding logistics himself, which I found endearing at the time. He said he wanted to make things easy for me. The folder wasn't hidden well. That was the first strange thing. I'd gone looking for a stapler in his home office, opened the wrong drawer, and there it was, sitting on top of a stack of old tax documents like he hadn't expected anyone to look. My name was on the tab, not Michael and Claire, just Claire. Inside were printouts of my brokerage statements, my retirement accounts, a property appraisal for the condo I'd bought on my own 4 years before I ever met him. And clipped to the front, a single sheet with numbers written in his handwriting, my numbers, added up into one total circled twice. I stood there for a long moment, not breathing, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he was planning something, a surprise, a gift. I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I did what I do for a living. I started looking closer. Over the next few days, I noticed things I'd overlooked before. Small comments I'd let slide because they seemed reasonable at the time. Michael mentioning, almost casually, how nice it would be to combine our accounts once we were married. Simpler for taxes, he said. Michael bringing up a document his lawyer could draft, just a standard post-nup structure that would let one spouse manage shared assets if the other traveled for work, which I sometimes did. Michael asking, more than once, exactly how much equity I had left on the condo. I called my friend Priya, who worked in commercial lending and had access to background verification tools. Most people didn't. I gave her Michael's name and asked her to run what she could through public filings. Nothing invasive, just the truth. She called me back 2 days later, and I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed so hard against my ear, it left a mark. Michael's consulting firm had filed for a lien 11 months earlier. Not from a bank, from a private lender who'd sued him for defaulting on $210,000 in personal loans, money he'd borrowed against investments that had since collapsed. The judgment was still open. He owed more than he'd ever admitted to owning. I sat with that information for 3 days before I understood what I actually had to do. I could have walked away quietly. I could have called off the wedding, returned the ring, told my mother it simply hadn't worked out, and let Michael recalibrate and find someone else to rebuild his finances on top of. Something told me, with the same certainty I feel when a spreadsheet finally balances, that he would. Men like him don't stop. They just find a new column to fill. So instead, I decided to build a case the way I would for any client, quietly, carefully, with paper that would hold up. I hired an estate attorney named Diane Cho, someone with no ties to Michael or our social circle. I told her everything, the folder, Priya's findings, the comments about combining accounts. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I still think about. She said what made this dangerous wasn't any single request. Couples merge finances all the time. What made it dangerous was the order, the timing, and the fact that every proposed document benefited exactly one person. Diane walked me through what would actually happen if I signed what Michael was likely to bring me. A joint account here, a beneficiary change there, a simplified estate document that sounded generous but functioned as a one-way transfer once the ink dried. Nothing illegal on its face, just quietly, permanently devastating. Over the following weeks, I became someone I'd never had to be. I smiled at dinner. I let him hold my hand across the table and talk about our future like it was already written. Every night I went home to my own apartment, which I hadn't given up despite his gentle suggestions that I should, and I lay awake running through everything I'd learned. Michael grew more confident as the wedding approached, not less. He mentioned the joint account again, framing it as something we should set up before the honeymoon so we wouldn't have to deal with paperwork later. He brought up adding his name to the condo deed, calling it a gesture of trust. Then, I read it slowly, the way I imagined he expected me to, nodding at the right places, asking one or two thoughtful questions to seem engaged rather than suspicious. Then I signed it. Every page. What Michael didn't know was that Diane and I had spent the previous 10 days preparing exactly for this moment. Weeks earlier, quietly and with full legal precision, I had moved the substantial majority of my actual assets, my retirement accounts, my savings, and eventually the equity in my condo, into an irrevocable trust with its own trustee and its own protections. The documents Michael had proudly handed me applied, in practice, to almost nothing. He held a folder full of signatures that looked like victory. In reality, he held very little at all. I want to be honest. Some small part of me still ached signing those papers, watching him thank me and kiss my forehead like he'd closed a deal, rather than promised his life to someone. I had loved the version of him he'd shown me for 8 months. Grieving that version turned out to be more complicated than I expected, even while I was quietly dismantling the real one. The final days moved fast after that. My mother arrived early, fussing over flowers, completely unaware of what was happening underneath what she assumed was simple wedding week nerves. Diane stayed close, coordinating everything, making sure every document and every finding was organized and ready. We agreed there would be no scene at a rehearsal dinner, no dramatic confrontation in a parking lot. If this was going to happen, it needed to happen exactly where Michael had planned to claim his victory, in front of everyone who believed in the man he'd built himself to look like. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in my dress, my mother fastening the last button, tears in her eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with what I knew. I looked at my own reflection and felt something settle into place. Calm, certain. I was ready. The ceremony moved forward exactly as planned. Vows were still ahead of us when the officiant reached the moment where he asked if anyone present had reason the two of us should not be joined. The room held its breath out of pure ceremonial habit, nobody actually expecting an answer. I spoke instead. I asked if I could say a few words first. I turned toward the guests, found Diane's steady face near the back of the room, and reached into my clutch for the folder I'd been carrying since that morning. I told the room, in a voice steadier than I expected, that 3 weeks earlier I had found a set of financial documents that changed everything I thought I laid it out without theatrics. The way Diane had taught me a case should be presented. The hidden debt, the lien, the requests to merge accounts and transfer property, timed precisely around our wedding date. I watched the color drain from Michael's face in real time as 200 guests went from confused to silent within the space of about 15 seconds. He reached for my arm, started to say something about how I was misunderstanding, taking things out of context. But Diane was already walking calmly to the front of the room, carrying a folder that looked almost identical to the one Michael had handed me weeks earlier, except everything inside hers was real. She explained briefly and without drama that every document Michael believed he'd secured that day applied to assets that had already been legally and irrevocably protected in advance, that his outstanding debt exceeded $200,000, undisclosed to the woman he was marrying, that there was, in short, nothing left for him to take. I watched guest by guest, people rise quietly from their seats and begin filing toward the doors, not in chaos, just with the particular silence of people who had watched something true happen in a room built for promises. My father stood beside me the whole time, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Michael stood alone near the altar as the last guests filed out, his carefully rehearsed charm completely useless against a room that had just heard exactly. I looked at him one final time and felt none of the things I expected. No rage, just the quiet, settled relief of someone who had done thorough work and watched it hold exactly as intended. Then I turned and walked out of that chapel on my father's arm, still in my wedding dress, toward whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, Michael's business partners quietly distanced themselves once word spread. The lender's judgment became public record, no longer something he could manage quietly. I went back to work, filed no announcements, and returned to my desk like any other Monday, because that's what 8 years of discipline teaches you to do. People ask me sometimes if I regret how public parts of this eventually became among people we both knew. I tell them no. If sharing what happened keeps even one other person from signing away their life to someone who rehearsed the words in advance, then standing in that chapel and speaking up was worth every uncomfortable second. I still believe in love, the real kind, the kind that doesn't come with hidden paperwork or a folder with your name quietly waiting in someone else's drawer. And I know that whatever comes next for me, I'll be walking into it with my eyes open, exactly the way I should have been from the start. If this story moved you, like this video, drop a comment telling me what stayed with you, and subscribe for more stories just like this one.